In this lecture, we are going to modify the block gap settings for our theme. A block gap refers to the space between blocks that are aligned side by side. In most cases, your content should have room to breathe. If elements are too close to each other, it can make your content appear cluttered. Let's look at an example. The columns block is an example of a block that implements gaps. We're going to quickly add the columns block to our template. The number of columns doesn't matter. As long as there are 2 or more columns, you're good to go. Inside all columns, add an image block. We're going to add images to demonstrate the spacing between columns. As you can see, there's a gap between both images. The size of the gap can be configured. In addition, we can enable settings for allowing users to customize this gap. We're going to enable these settings, as well as increase the default gap. Before we do, let's look at how the gap gets applied. I'm going to save the post. Rather than inspecting the CSS in the editor, we're going to view the home page of our site. WordPress adds additional markup that can be confusing to look at. The final output of the template will be much easier to read. Once you're on the home page, inspect the images. The element we're looking for is a div tag with a class called WP Block Columns. Looking closely at the styles, WordPress uses Flex for creating columns. The most important property is the gap property. This property will determine the gap between each column. We can't remove this property, but we can override it. Let's try configuring the gap settings for our theme. In your text editor, open the theme.json file. First, let's enable the settings for configuring the gap. In the Settings object, we're going to update the spacing option. Add a new property called Block Gap with a value of true. You must enable these settings if you want to configure the gap for your theme. Otherwise, WordPress will not allow you to override the value. By turning this setting on, users will be allowed to customize the gap. As theme developers, we should recommend a default gap. I think the gap between images is too small. I would like to give more breathing room to our columns. Scroll to the Styles object. We're going to modify the spacing property. Let's add a property called Block Gap with a value of 4 rem. The value for the gap must be a valid CSS value. Configuring this value will vary from theme to theme. You will need to experiment with this option for the best possible value. Let's try testing our theme by refreshing the home page. Awesome! The gap between images has increased. We're going to keep this gap for our theme. Once we start adding the template and asset files, this is going to come out great for our theme. We're finished with our discussion of the layout settings for WordPress. Let's wrap up our discussion in the next lecture.